Hey everyone, it's Tanya Meisenholder and Mo McGough.
Nice to see y'all.
In rare form, we're actually together in the same room, and we're so excited about this webinar today with Chief Sheryl Victorian from the Waco Police Department. So she's going to tell us a bit about herself and her story, some of the challenges that she's faced, and also giving us the opportunity to ask her anything that we want. When we get to that section, we might hit pause on recording just so everyone can be very open and transparent without fear of everything being recorded. A few comments before we get started. Tomorrow starts Women's History Month. So we're really hopeful that everyone is going to advocate for the promotion of women in policing during Women's History Month. And Mo, anything else to add on updates?
I don't think so. Just a reminder, Tanya sent out a super helpful email with resources for you all about how you might be able to get the word out about your agency's great work during Women's History Month. And we'll also send out our newsletter either tomorrow or Monday, which will have all those resources in them again.
So a bit about Chief Victorian before we get started. She's currently the chief of Waco Police Department. She's been there since 2021, the first female chief, the first woman of color as well. And prior to that, she has a long history in the Houston Police Department for about 28 years in a variety of roles, including patrol and vehicular crimes. She is a fantastic mentor and is very passionate about children. I'm well aware of that as well. And we're super psyched to hear from her today, hear about her story, and then ask her the questions that so many of us have. So I welcome everyone to our webinar, first one of the year, and to Chief Sheryl Victorian. And Chief, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, fantastic. Well, welcome everyone. Let me start by thanking Mo, Yvonne, and Tanya just for inviting me to participate in this inaugural Ask Me Anything series and for their advocacy in every area of women in policing. I mean, we've heard for years that our agencies need to be representative of our departments and of our communities, right? But our first thoughts when this is happening is race and ethnicity. Okay, I'm not even sure if it was expected that we be represented equally in policing in our communities, but these ladies are at the forefront of seeing that that happens.
I started emptying the dishwasher and I stopped.
Hey, I just wanted to let everyone know, if you're not on mute, please mute.
All right. So I appreciate each and every one of you on today. And I'm grateful to be able to use this platform to talk about my career path and the lessons that I've learned along the way. Honestly, I get very full each time I get to share because I'm reminded of the ladies who struggled and paved the way for me to witness female success at every level in police agencies. And I get full now because I'm privileged with the story and an opportunity to encourage and influence others to reach their potential. So I have a whole lot of lessons, but I know we're on a schedule and I want to make sure that I allot time for the Ask Me Anything on this Ask Me Anything Zoom. So let me get started. I never wanted to be a police officer initially as a young child. I was afraid of police officers. My mom would just try to get me to shake a constable's hand at our local grocery store, and I'd fall out. I mean, at 4 or 5 years old, I'm falling out crying, embarrassed. No, embarrassing her. No, I don't want to shake his hand or whatever, right? And then a couple of years later, I had this mischievous neighbor who fabricated a story about the police helicopter landing on our street and looking for Sheryl, who was a tourist, right? I'm 7, so I fell for it. You know, I didn't know police didn't ask for your sign. And every time my friends and I would hear that Houston Police Department helicopter fly over my mom's house, we'd hide behind trees, cars, bushes, you name it, right? And then a couple of years later, I lost my dad at 9. And it was then that my perception of policing began to change because I remember those police officers standing outside of the funeral home and their compassion and their empathy toward my family and I. And then I watched them as they escorted us out of the city to go bury my dad. And I started thinking, you know, what respect, what compassion, these guys are not looking for me kind of thing. And, you know, I began to have a different perspective of them. And then, by the time I turned 15 and in high school, the show Miami Vice came out. and Ricardo and Tubbs were my guys, and I was going to work undercover, right? I had to be a cop because I wanted to work undercover. And then not only that, a couple of years before that, Beverly Hills Cops 1, Eddie Murphy, right? I wanted to work undercover. So I knew at that point what my path was going to be. And I knew that police officers had integrity, they had character, and there were certain decisions I could make and couldn't make. So I made my way to it, right? I was too scared to do anything wrong because I knew what I wanted to do. Finished college, went to the Houston Police Department, you know, spent my 6.5 months in the academy, got out on the streets, and there I was policing, excited to be policing, right? Had great trainers, didn't have any bad experiences during the training program. I was never a small girl. Anybody that knows me knows I'm at least 6 feet tall. And back then, I'll tell you how much weight. I made about 175. So I looked like I could take care of myself, right? And I got respect. But little did I know, once I got off the program, I was excited to be a police officer. I loved doing what I was doing, but I was kind of overdoing it in comparison to some of my colleagues, right? But there was not a call holding in my beat if I was at work that day. There was not a report that wasn't going to be made. There was not an arrest that was not going to be made. Because I think essentially what I was doing was proving that I belonged here, right? At that time, HPD probably represented about 7 to 8% females. But again, with an agency that size, we did have ladies who had before me promoted and were leading, but not very many, but there were some. And so I found myself doing the extra stuff, right? And I would get messages on our MDCs, which we had just got back in 1993, saying, slow down, slow down, you're making us look bad, and it was kind of said in jest, but in a way, I know that they were serious, right? But there was not a time that I didn't hear an officer on the radio requesting a female officer, and if I was on duty and if I was available, that I wasn't going to check by. I took advantage of all of those opportunities, and those opportunities to do things like that opened some doors for me, right? But let me tell you this first lesson. I know that in the introduction, or they mentioned that I was the first that I won Rookie of the Year, right? So I was the first African-American female to win Rookie of the Year in 1995 for my rookie year of 1994. So on December 28th, 1993, I was still on probation, living in my apartment complex, and I got home. At the time, it was my boyfriend and I had a new puppy, and I walked up the stairs, and as we were opening the door, I heard screaming. And I was like, what is that? And I turned around and I looked at my neighbor's building across the way. On the 3rd floor, there was a fire on the 3rd floor of the apartment. And I knew that there was a single mom that lived there with her 11-year-old handicapped daughter and her son. And so by then I had the puppy had come to the door. I had her, and I just dropped her at the bottom of the stairs, and I ran up the stairs. And fortunately, the young lady had made it into the hallway. And by the time I'd gotten up the stairs, the fire had started coming out of their apartment door. And I'm saying this in prayer, but I was like, is your brother in there? Is your brother in there? And she said no, and thank God he wasn't. So I grabbed her, we ran down the floor, ran down 3 flights of stairs. Fire department came, everything was well. And then I get this phone call from ABC 13 in Houston. And they were like, hey, we understand that you got a young girl out of a fire, and we want to highlight you this week in our officer profile. And I was like, no, sir, no, I don't want to do that. I was good. I would think that anybody who would have heard that would have responded the same way. And they were like, well, okay, you got 24 hours, call us back or whatever. Then I went and started talking to some people, and they were like, yeah, you need to do that, right? And I was like, well, I just didn't want to bring any attention to myself. Like I was going to be able to hide under the radar, right? And so I got to work for my next shift, and people were encouraging me to do it, called them, and it was too late. And so they were like, no, we'd already found somebody to highlight or whatever, but, thanks for calling us back. And so my first lesson to you is, when you do something big and somebody wants to appreciate you, because as women, sometimes we step back from that. We try to remain humble, but we can't hide under the radar. Don't hide under the radar. Don't dim your light, right? When somebody acknowledges you for a job well done, don't downplay it. Just say thank you, say it with a smile, and move on. And I'm really guilty of saying, I don't need credit for it, but as long as nobody else don't take credit for what I've done, right? But take credit for your work, right? And it doesn't mean that you're boasting or about yourself. It just means that you appreciate somebody acknowledges the good that you've done and that you recognize it, okay? So, but what happened was my lieutenant at the time, he's retired as an assistant chief with Houston, but he was my lieutenant at the time. His name was John Trevino, and he heard what happened and he nominated me for a life-saving award. So during my rookie year, I was able to get a life-saving award, right? And then on top of that, I was ripping and running and leading an arrest and calls of service and reports. And so all of that happened. Next thing you know, I get a letter saying that I had been nominated and had been selected as the 100 Club of Houston. This was all of Houston, all public safety agencies in Houston as the Rookie of the Year. And I embraced that and I loved that. And I had a grad too, and I got a nice Rolex for it too. But anyway, it was a great experience, right? And it was really just the beginning. Had no idea what doors would open or what would happen. But after being on the streets, after being off probation and being on the streets by myself for a year, an opening came open in our gang task force unit. It was the divisional gang task force unit where we were still assigned to patrol and in patrol cars, but we would focus on those areas, those problem areas in our districts and beats where there was gang issues. So I didn't think I'd have a shot because I didn't have a lot of time on. I'd only had that year out on the street by myself. So I decided to apply for it. And lo and behold, I got the position. And, you know, it was kind of unheard of in the Houston Police Department for somebody with less than 2 years on to have Sunday, Monday, Tuesday off. Now, we were working 4 p.m. to 2 a.m. Wednesday through Saturday, but I still had a good day off, right? And I had a great time doing that. But right when I got that call to do that, I get a call from a sergeant in Major Offenders Division. Y'all, I didn't even know there was a Major Offenders Division or what Major Offenders did. Okay. But the call went something like this. Hey, we're looking for somebody to do some undercover work for us. And your name came up. Would you be interested? I didn't ask him what we were going to do, what kind of undercover work was going to happen. I was Ricardo in Tubbs and I was working undercover. So I was like, oh yeah. And so on my own time for over a year, I would go on the first, second, and third of the month to Major Offenders Division and work undercover investigations. I would go in I would earn comp time. I couldn't get overtime. I would work comp time and then I'd go in and work my shift, right? So sometimes to get what you want, you have to make some sacrifices, right? And here I'm about to date myself, but hopefully some of you on this call know what I'm about to say. Do y'all actually remember food stamps? So I was working food stamp deals, right? Where I'd go into these stores and I'd sell the retailers food stamps, and they give you like 50 cents on the dollar, right? Against the law. So I did that for over a year. Wasn't the most glamorous type of undercover work, but I did it. And then after a year of just going over to help them, a long-term investigation came up for a credit card fraud group. And I was able to go over there on a temporary basis. And after 4 months and 42 arrests, a position opened in Major Offenders Division. And they didn't go through that process because many times we have processes and you know who's going to get selected and they still waste people's time. Well, I had a commander who had the courage to say, nope. She's been over here. She's been doing the work. She's earned this position. And so I had an opportunity to go to Major Offenders. It was absolutely phenomenal. I got to do that for 11 and a half years. And it was fantastic, right? So the crooks started getting a little offenders, started getting a little younger. I started getting a little older. And I decided, maybe it's time for me to move on. And at that time, I had already taken a sergeant's exam and I was on the list to promote to sergeant, right? And so I called my old supervisor who actually called me to come work in Major Offenders, and he had worked in homicide. And I was like, hey, there's a position open in homicide. What do you think about me going to homicide? And he was like, I think that would be a good opportunity for you, Cheryl. He said, so he said, you're on the sergeant's list. He said, so if it doesn't work out the way that you think it should work out, he said, then you're going to promote. You're going to promote out of homicide, right? He said, but that experience would be exceptional for you. I was like, okay, I'll do that. So I applied. I became #1 on the list. And I don't know how many of you watch cop shows. I usually don't, but I started watching the first 48 hours because I was going to be the best homicide detective that I could be. And so got over the homicide. Now I'd given up day shift, weekends off, a take-home car, had all the perks, had overtime to go night shift Tuesday, Wednesday, and homicide. But it was a sacrifice, right? And I didn't want to get stalled in my career. So I realized that I had to make a sacrifice again if I wanted to get where I wanted to go in my career. So I went to homicide. I eventually, after a couple of weeks, got Sunday, Monday again, but went to homicide, worked 13 scenes in 4 months between December 30th of 2006 to May 2007. I got there and it wasn't what I thought. It wasn't the first 48 hours. There was not a lot of training. So I had to buy basic homicide investigator books. I had to go to experienced homicide investigators' cases and read their cases because I showed up in the second night. They gave me my own scene and handed me a card that was half the size of 8.5 by 11. And said, okay, you're a homicide investigator. And I was so disappointed, right? And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. What about the training? Oh, you have investigative experience. Well, I know many of you understand this when I say this, but there's a difference between having proactive investigative experience and reactive investigative experience, particularly if you're going to be speaking on behalf of somebody who can no longer speak for themselves. So I realized that we had a gap in training in homicide. And so I started developing myself. And that's a lesson. Just know that you're not going to always get the tools that you need to be the best that you can be in some of these positions, but go do your homework and talk to people from other agencies. That's why it's so important to network and have a group of networking friends and trusted advisors, right? So I did that for a little more than 5 months, or right at about 5 months, and then got a call and promoted to sergeant. Now, here's another lesson. I don't know how many of your agencies do this, but with Houston PD, after 5 years, it used to be 2 years when I first got there, you could take the sergeant's exam, right? But it was after 5 years, you can take the sergeant's exam. And most people did, and they would promote. And then after 2 years, you could take the lieutenant's exam and then promote to lieutenant and have 7 years on as a lieutenant. And 2 years later, take the commander's exam, right? If you were on that fast track. I didn't promote to sergeant to my first rank until I had 14 years on the department. And, a lot of people think, man, it's too late for me. It's too late for me. No, it's not too late for you. I spent 7 years as a sergeant. I didn't promote to lieutenant until I had 21 years on the police department. It is not too late for you. When I promoted to lieutenant, 2 years later, I promoted to commander. 11 months after that, I promoted to assistant chief. And it was always my vision or my goal to promote to assistant chief, and for a number of reasons, and I'll have to tell you that story. But for those of you that feel like you're stuck and it's too late for you to promote and move forward, it is never too late for you to move forward in your career. That 14 years as an officer was the foundation of who I am as a leader, at the executive level, as a chief, as an assistant chief. And being able to relate to officers and things that are going on at the officer level, that worked for me. And promoting early works for a lot of people, right? But that worked for me. And I just want to make sure that you guys understand that it is never too late. I don't care where you are in your career. So left homicide, promoted to sergeant, went to back to the streets, back to patrol, and then got a call to I worked investigative first responders, which was a unit where we had the opportunity to train patrol officers for investigative work, right? For those calls that we could work from start to finish. Those were the calls that the investigative first responders took, right? We gathered the evidence, we got the warrants, and we did everything to the arrest, right? So we could develop officers for patrol. So that was right up my alley. I loved doing that. Then got a call to go to child sexual abuse. Went to child sexual abuse. After about a year, my lieutenant transferred me to the squad where we had the proactive units, which was a lot of fun, the Innocence Lost Task Force, and Internet Crimes Against Children, the FBI Task Force. I was very comfortable. I had the top of the line investigators, right? I just read warrants, ran warrants, read their cases, right? And I was good because I had a good bunch who were self-motivated. And I get this call in January of 2009, and this gentleman says, "Hey, I need you to come sign your paperwork. You are reporting to Internal Affairs Division on February 5th. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute, right? At the time, Internal Affairs was involuntary. So I said, sir, and he repeated it matter-of-factly, and like, you need to come sign your paperwork today. And I was like, yes, sir, okay. So I went around the corner of my lieutenant, and I was like, hey, I just got a call from IED. They're telling me I need to report to IED to sign paperwork and that I'm transferring on the 5th. And so she was so sweet. Oh, no, ma'am. No, that's not going to happen. We need you here. I'm going to write a letter to the chief and da, 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 da. And then she says, but in the meantime, go sign the paperwork because I don't want us to be insubordinate, right? And so I did. So I went and signed the paperwork. She wrote the letter up the chain. A couple of days later, it came back and said, no, she's going. And so I went to IED, but before I got there, I ran into a gentleman in the parking lot, in Southeast Houston. That was the patrol division we worked at and where child sexual abuse was. And he said, hey, I didn't know this gentleman, but apparently he knew me. He said, hey, I understand that you're trying to get out of internal affairs. And I was like, well, you know, I was really comfortable. I was good. He said, we're not meant to be comfortable. You shouldn't be comfortable. He said, and think about it like this. He said, internal affairs is a place that you can go where you can help officers keep their job because of bogus complaints, or you can work, you know, you have investigative experience, work that case where officers who are not representing us well are tarnishing a badge. They shouldn't be here. You make a fact-finding case, right? And I was like, you know what, you're right. He said, go in with an open mind. And I was like, okay, that's what I'll do, right? So anyway, I transferred to IAD. I was exactly as he said. I was apparently a very naive 19-year officer when I first got, sergeant when I first got there, because I thought most of us did the right things for the right reasons, and learned that we made some silly decisions off duty, right? And so much so that I wanted to put a sign in my cubicle that said, you know, what were you thinking? I didn't get approval for that, but I worked in ID reactive cases for about a year. And then I worked the 30-day squad where we had to work expedited cases for the chief for about 3 months. And then I had an opportunity to go and work proactive internal affairs division. I know many of you know that an agency the size of Houston or larger, that there are some officers who may start with a genuine heart and become corrupt. And so we worked undercover investigations on police officers that were accused of committing crimes and promoted out of internal affairs to lieutenant. Now, let me tell you, at this time, when I first became a police officer, as a rookie police officer, I had already set a goal for myself to promote to assistant chief, right? I didn't know how to get there initially, but my reason for wanting to do that was because I'm sitting in roll call one day and there's this gentleman, he comes in, looks really important, really official, dressed to a T in his uniform. He had stars on his collar, and he even had on his cover. And I asked one of my colleagues, I was like, who is this guy? And he was like, oh, that's our assistant chief. And I'm thinking, I said, he's rude. He didn't even speak. He didn't ask us how we're doing. I said, he just came in looking important, right? I said, but you know what? I'm sorry, guys. I said, you know what? I am going to become chief of police, assistant chief one day. And I'm going to show you that you can still have personality and be authentic and genuine and do this job, right? And I was a young police officer, again, never knew how I would get there, but I wanted to be an assistant chief. That reason changed as I began to promote and matured in policing, but I still wanted to be an assistant chief. And but by the time I got year 20, I had started working on my PhD. And I had gone to the department for some stats on tasers, right? But apparently we had this committee that looked at all the research before it was conducted and made a decision whether or not to allow that study to happen. And so I was doing an exploratory study of taser use in Texas, and I was going to rely on my agency's data as well as, you know, the other 8 agencies that I'd selected, but I got turned down by my own agency to get that data. I had gone to the chief. The chief was like, oh, yeah, I have to give it to you. And then one day I get this call from an executive assistant chief saying, hey, I see this request. I said, he was like, we're going to have to deny it because it's on the list of things that can't be researched. And I was like, well, what do you mean? I said, I talked to the chief and he said, yes. And he said, well, sometimes the chief says yes when he should say no. I'm not, I didn't run back to the chief and say somebody just undermined your decision or whatever. Instead, I went to my dissertation chair. I was upset at HPD and I was about to retire. I was like, you know what? When I get my 20, I'm leaving and I'm going to go teach. And so I was at that phase, right, when the books came out for the lieutenant's exam. And so it comes out in an email and everybody's anticipating it. It has all the books and everybody runs right out, get the books, get the general orders. And I start hearing some of my colleagues around me saying that they were going to take the exam. They were going to take the exam. And I started thinking to myself, Sheryl, what if you stay? If you stay, can you work for him? Can you work for her? Or, and so I started thinking to myself, you know what, you better take that exam and then if you decide to stay, because there's some people that their work ethic, their leadership, their management style, and you're like, I don't think I want to work for that person, right? So that was one of the reasons I decided to take the lieutenant's exam. I'm glad that I did. Got over my anger, finished my dissertation, went back to child sexual abuse, worked the training unit, took the commander's exam. And while I was working in the training unit, and people always say, well, why did you go out and get your PhD? Did you need your PhD? Well, one reason I got my PhD was because doing undergrad, if I just didn't have a heart for policing and what I wanted to do, I probably would have changed my major because I had a lot of instructors who had that academic knowledge and that theory, but no practice, right? And so I was like, you know what? One day I want to go in the classroom and I want to have that experience and I want to be able to talk about my experiences as well as the academic part of it. So I did earn my PhD, but another reason for having my PhD was, and many of your agencies may do this, the testing process is very competitive, right? So you have the test, you have the assessment center, and then they add your years of service, and then they add either 1, 2, or 3 points for either for military or education based on your degree level. And I'm not a very good standardized test taker. I promoted on all of my exams from the assessment center. I can tell you that, right? I was an 80-ish, kind of 85-ish at the most kind of test taker, where on our test, people were getting 99s and 100s, right? But I'd come back in the assessment center and I would prove myself. Well, for the commander's exam, it was very, very, very competitive. And after the test, I was number 40 on the list. And then after the assessment center, and my 3 points, I moved to number 3. So it was significant, right? So I promoted to commander and I went back to patrol. When I first became a police officer, all I wanted to do was put the bad guy in jail. And I would put my mom in jail, really. I would have gotten her out, but I would have put her in jail. But then as I developed and matured as a police officer, I realized we couldn't arrest our way out of everything, right? And so prevention and intervention became just as important to me as apprehension. And so that's when I began my community service run, right? Because at first that community service to me, it wasn't police work, right? But all of it is relative. And we have to take a holistic approach as leaders in our organizations to address crime, connect with the community, right? Those bad guys still have to go to jail, but it became important. So as a commander, my community engagement just increased significantly, right? We started doing back to school bashes, trunk or treats, anything that we could do to engage the community, we began to do it. And after 11 months, I got a call to promote to assistant chief. And the chief calls me in and he says, so it was Chief Acevedo at the time, and he had given us 3 to 5 years. I had already heard this in advance. He wants his assistant chiefs to be in place for 3 to 5 years and then move on, right? And so he calls me in and he says, hey, he said, I have a position, whatever. I want to offer you this position. Are you going to be ready to leave in 3 to 5 years? And of course, I'm not about to turn down an assistant chief job. So I was like, yeah. I said, if he said, you're still relatively young. And I was like, if I need to leave, I can go teach, right? But I'm thinking to myself in my back of my mind, I hope you go first and I can stick around, right? And promote to the next level, right? So anyways, I promoted to assistant chief. And as an assistant chief, I was responsible for, we had 3 patrol regions. Houston covers 670 something square miles. So I had about a third of the city, as well as vehicular crimes division. Was an opportunity for me to lead at that level and develop professionally other commanders that were under my command. I had a great time. I was putting out fires every day. Didn't know that anything else existed, right? After about 3 years, I get a phone call from a gentleman who was the former president of our union. And he says, hey, I just got a call from Waco and they're looking for a police chief. And I was like, oh, that's nice. Cause I'm thinking, why is he calling me, telling me that, right? And so he was like, well, the work that you're doing, it just really sounds like the person that they're looking for. He said, and they started telling me about it. You're the first person I thought of. He's like, I'm not trying to get rid of you or anything. He said, but it just sounds like a really good opportunity. And I was like, oh, that's sweet. So he says, are you looking to promote the chief? And I was like, well, I hadn't really thought about it, maybe one day or whatever. And he was like, well, if you do promote the chief, he said, do you think you would leave the Houston area? And I'm like, no. I'm good. It's too many police agencies around the city of Houston for me to leave Houston, leave my family. No, not gonna do that. And so he was like, well, he said, okay. He said, well, this sounds like a good opportunity. When I told them about you, they got excited and asked me if I would ask you to apply. And so the rest is up to you. And I was like, oh, thank you. That's sweet. And I hung up the phone and I thought to myself, I'm not moving to Waco. I had only been to Waco, Texas one time. It's three hours from Houston. My sisters and I made it a 2-day drive because we left Houston at 10:30 and made it to College Station at midnight. But the highway that you take from Houston to Waco is very dark. So we got off the road. And I had a meeting at the Waco Police Department the next day at 1:00. It was for the matter of fact, we had just started the Texas Police Chiefs Association Women's Executive Leadership Panel, and I was selected to be on the panel. And Waco is centrally located. It really is in the heart of Texas. So we all met here. Got here at 1. My sisters were with me. My meeting lasted till 4. We got back on the road and got back to Houston. Okay. So that was my only time here in 2019. And so after I got off the phone, I'm a person of faith, and I just felt like the Spirit was saying, just go look, just go read the profile, just go look at it. And finally I said, okay, I'll go look. And I went and looked, and every bullet point, I was like, man, I can do that. That is what I'm doing. I can be chief, right? And I got my sisters on the phone and I was like, hey, I'm thinking about applying for the chief job in Waco. And they were like, oh, no, ma'am, how far is Waco? How much are they paying? They asked the sister questions. And then one of them was like, well, let's just pray about it, see what happens. And that's exactly what I did. Submitted my resume and cover letter and went through the process. Was announced as one of the final 4, and I started getting nervous. I'm like, man, they're being very intentional about who they want for this job. I need to make sure this is somewhere I want to be as well. So what I did was my sister and I came down on January the 2nd, 2021, and we drove the city. And that night I was feeling kind of uneasy, and she could tell. And so the next day we got to see another side of the city, right? And I didn't realize it was 100 square miles. It was a big city, it's a mid-sized city, but as big as it was. And it had all the places that it had. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'm feeling good about this. We can do this. So after that, I picked up the phone, and there was a gentleman in Houston who knew somebody here in Waco. And I told him what I was doing. And I said, do you think it would happen to be his nephew? He said, do you think your nephew would talk to me? I want to talk about the city, and I want to ask him about the relationship with the police department, because I'm, applying to be chief there. And he was like, absolutely. So he gave me this gentleman's phone number, and I called him. sometimes we have to step outside of our comfort zone and have some courage and talk to some trained strangers, right? And we, just as I said, just as Waco was deliberate, I wanted to be deliberate. So we have to be deliberate about our careers. So I talked to about 10 people, and that's probably the minimum. As soon as I got off the phone with one, I would say, hey, is there anybody else in the city you think I should talk to? I talked to retired police officers. I talked to police officers who had left the job, right? I wanted to know about the city. I wanted to know about this job. And after those conversations, I felt really good about my decision to continue on in this process. And the time came for my final interview, came down here to Waco. They took me to Magnolia Table. Anybody, I'm sure when you hear Waco, you think of Chip and Joanna. The restaurant is fantastic. And they took me there for lunch. And then we went to the operations center at 1 o'clock, and the assistant city manager was the former chief here in Waco. And so they put me in this room, big square table. And then he says, Chief Victorian, today we want to talk about, we're going to examine your resume and talk about your resume. I sat up in my seat and I put my chest out, because nobody knows my resume better than me, right? Nobody knows my experience better than me. And the same thing for you. There's no reason why we should discount any of the work that we do. And that was my time to shine. So I decided to do that. So he asked the questions, I gave the answer. I felt good about it. If I didn't get this job, I was going to be good because I had a good job in Houston, right? Well, 30 minutes after my interview was over, the city manager texted and said, hey, I want to talk to you at 5 o'clock. And I'm like, oh, wow, that quick. Okay, well, can you let me leave the city before you tell me I don't have a job? And so he calls, my sisters are with me, and he offers me the job. And I've been here since I started this job March the 15th. 2021, and I have been here almost 3 years now. It has been a total blessing. For those of you who think that there is not life outside of your current city, there's life outside of your city, and there are places where you can go where you can thrive. If you're at that executive level and like, I never want to be a chief, I'm good, I don't need that responsibility, step outside of your comfort zone. Yes, you can do it. And I'm having the time of my life here in Waco. Whew. So that was a lot, and it was very, very quick, but it was my story. And I can open it up for questions now.
Chief, I get so excited talking to you because you are just phenomenal. Your smile, you radiate your passion. It's absolutely amazing. Just a couple of things I want to touch on real quick, because I took all your lessons, and what I heard is, don't dim your light. The reality of having to make sacrifices in law enforcement and what that means, especially for women, and whether that's something that we can change over the course of time, that you might have to develop yourself because someone else might not help you or give you those tools. And it's never too late is a really important one, and that you weren't necessarily meant to be comfortable. In order to grow, you have to get outside of your comfort zone and be very deliberate. And I think those resonate, with so many of us. So first, before I turn the recording off real quick, I just wanted to say thank you. You are an amazing storyteller, and I think the power of stories is sometimes something that gets lost on all of us, because you can pick up so much. And to your point, no one knows your story better than you do. So thank you for doing this.